Diego walked through the marble hall of the mansion as if he owned the world. His arrogant gaze reflected the confidence of someone who had always had everything within reach. With every step, he displayed a natural arrogance, cultivated since childhood. To him, nothing was impossible when you had money, and no one had ever truly dared to challenge him. Breakfast was served with excessive luxury: exotic fruits, freshly baked bread, and imported juices. Diego ate distractedly, scrolling through his phone and laughing at superficial messages. Meanwhile, employees moved around silently, attentive to his every move. The routine seemed perfect, but it hid a void. Nothing truly challenged him. Nothing made him feel small. Despite his youth, Diego was already being groomed as the successor to the family empire. His father, a respected tycoon, demanded that he take on business responsibilities early. But Diego saw everything as a game. To him, numbers were just figures, not human destinies. The real world seemed distant, as if it were a play in which he always occupied the center stage. In the hallways of the mansion, portraits of his ancestors reminded him of where he came from: serious men, founders and conquerors of fortune. Diego saw himself as the heir to an inevitable legacy. But deep down, the inheritance was a burden disguised as a privilege. Everything had been handed to him on a silver platter, and that had blinded him to the real value of things. In the morning, his father's phone rang and an urgent message came through. The company was facing serious problems. Analysts, programmers, and experts were frustrated by an invisible obstacle. But Diego, however, didn't even blink. He found amusement in others' distress, certain that, somehow, everything would resolve itself without any effort on his part. In the luxurious car on the way to the company headquarters, Diego looked out at the city with disdain. The traffic, people rushing, the ordinary buildings, everything seemed insignificant compared to the power he carried in his last name. While many struggled to survive, he only thought about how he would spend the next night at parties. When he arrived, he was greeted by tense directors. The heavy atmosphere contrasted with his ironic smile. He felt in charge, even without understanding the real scale of the threat. And that was typical of his attitude, playing leader without truly carrying the weight of leadership. The company's hallways were modern, filled with screens and colorful graphs. But that day, everything showed numbers in the red. Diego wasn't fazed. To him, it was just another passing crisis. After all, there had always been someone to solve problems before they reached him. Yet something in the air felt different. The tension wasn't just coming from reports or balance sheets. It was as if everyone was expecting a disaster bigger than anything they could measure. But Diego, trapped in his bubble of arrogance, didn't care. He was about to discover that not every problem can be bought, and that sometimes the solution comes where you least expect it. Diego thinks money can buy everything, but he's about to find out that real power lies where he least expects it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the moment his arrogant world comes crashing down. In the meeting room, the advisors stood up as soon as Diego entered. Some carried overstuffed folders, others held digital reports on tablets. The atmosphere was charged, almost suffocating. But the air seemed immune, sprawling in the leather chair as if he were at home. He didn't take anything seriously. The oldest advisor cleared his throat before speaking. He explained that the company had lost millions in international contracts. The reason? An encryption algorithm that blocked vital information. Every analyst they'd hired had failed to crack it. It was a puzzle that paralyzed entire departments. But Diego just raised an eyebrow, indifferent. To him, it was all just exaggeration. If the best can solve it, hire even better ones, he said arrogantly, drawing looks of desperation. The advisors had already hired the best. None of them had come close to a solution. The problem wasn't a lack of effort, it was complexity.
The company was trapped in a technological maze. Every attempt to break the code resulted in new barriers, more confusing and intricate. It was like fighting an invisible enemy. Diego, however, laughed at the description. He compared the dilemma to a simple video game. To him, all it took was patience. But no one had months or years to wait. While the others spoke, Diego distracted himself with the reflection in the window. He didn't understand the urgency, nor did he care. His world had always been driven by the certainty that problems were temporary. But that day, his disbelief bordered on irresponsibility. He was about to lose more than money. He risked losing respect. Some advisors whispered among themselves. They feared Diego wasn't ready to lead. His behavior seemed like that of a spoiled brat, not a prepared heir. But no one dared say it out loud. The family name still carried more weight than any individual failure.
A report was projected onto the screen, showing the mounting losses. Graphs were plunging like mountains in free fall. The mood in the meeting was almost funeral-like. But Diego, with a sarcastic smile, asked, "And this is what's making you all so nervous?" His comment cut through the air like a knife. The advisors were running out of patience. They were facing a real threat, but the heir treated it all like a meaningless show. Diego seemed unbeatable in his ignorance, but deep down, that attitude made him more vulnerable than he could imagine. Because that very same day, chance would bring a little girl into his life who would change everything. A mind capable of seeing patterns that no one else could. While Diego was drowning in pointless meetings, silence ruled in another part of the mansion. Sophia, just 10 years old, was casually doodling in her worn-out notebook. Her pencil moved quickly across the pages, sketching numbers, geometric shapes, and sequences that seemed random but made perfect sense to her. What others saw as mere child's play, Sophia saw as discovery. The girl had attentive, always curious eyes. She noticed patterns in shadows, in people's footsteps, even in the sound of water dripping from the kitchen faucet. Her mind was like a kaleidoscope, constantly turning. She didn't know she was different. To Sophia, thinking that way was as natural as breathing. Her mother had worked as a maid in the mansion since Sophia was born. Proud of her daughter, but not fully understanding her abilities, she simply encouraged her to stay out of trouble. Their home was simple but filled with love. In the mansion, Sophia found vast spaces that became her testing ground for ideas. She often spent hours looking through forgotten books in the luxurious library. They weren't children's books, but that didn't intimidate her. She flipped through pages filled with complex formulas, and even without understanding every word, deciphered the hidden logic. To her, knowledge had no barriers, only open doors waiting to be crossed. That afternoon, while her mother cleaned the main hall, Sophia approached Diego. He was on the sofa, bored, scrolling through his phone and sighing at business messages. The girl watched from a distance, curious. To her, Diego seemed to live in a strange world where nothing really mattered except his own arrogance. "Why do you always look so grumpy?" Sophia asked, with the spontaneity only children have. Diego laughed sarcastically, as if the question were absurd. The maid panicked, apologizing in whispers, but Diego didn't mind. He was almost amused by the little girl's boldness. He looked at her with superiority. To him, Sophia was just an ordinary child, unimportant. The contrast was striking. The heir, surrounded by luxury,
and the maid's daughter with her worn-out notebook, but in her eyes was something Diego didn't recognize: confidence. "You don't understand anything about what I do," he said, trying to end the conversation. Sophia smiled and replied, "I can solve your problems." The words, spoken with pride and naturalness, sounded like a challenge. Diego burst out laughing. How could a child even imagine the weight of the responsibilities he carried? To Diego, it was just a naive remark. To Sophia, it was simply the truth. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to prove it. And Diego didn't know that this little promise would change his life forever. The next day, Diego returned home still irritated from the previous meeting. The advisors kept emphasizing the seriousness of the situation, but he couldn't stand being pressured. When he saw Sophia playing in the hallway with her notebook, a mocking thought crossed his mind. He called the girl over, smiling ironically. "So you solve my problems, do you? Let's see about that." He grabbed a copy of the enigmatic document filled with indecipherable symbols and patterns. To him, this was the perfect opportunity to show that Sophia was nothing but a presumptuous child. The maid paled at the scene. She tried to intervene, begging the boss's son not to make fun of her daughter. But Diego silenced her with a gesture. The challenge was on, and everyone knew his intention was not to teach, but to humiliate. Sophia took the pages calmly, without fear. She looked at the symbols like someone examining a fun puzzle. Silence filled the room. Diego, seated in his armchair, watched with the smile of someone expecting a joke. To him, the girl's failure was inevitable. But Sophia didn't seem anxious. She ran her fingers over the lines, scribbled notes in her notebook, erased, and started again. Her eyes shined with each discovery, invisible to others. The atmosphere shifted. What began as an attempt to humiliate was slowly turning into curiosity. Diego, still laughing, tried to hide his discomfort. He expected tears, surrender, confusion. But what he saw was concentration. The girl wasn't just understanding. She seemed to be enjoying herself. Unease began to grow within him. Sophia's mother, standing in the background, watched fearfully. She worried her daughter would be punished for not being able to solve something so complex. But Sophia didn't carry the weight of failure the way adults did. To her, every mistake was just a step toward the answer. Diego, growing impatient, crossed his arms and taunted, "So, prodigy, given up yet?" Sophia looked up seriously and replied, "Not yet. I told you I solve your problems." The confident tone of a child's voice echoed like an unexpected challenge. And for the first time, Diego felt a slight shiver of uncertainty. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of Sophia's pencil scratching on paper. Diego watched with a mix of mockery and impatience, waiting for the moment the girl would give up. But instead, every line she drew seemed to bring her closer to something concrete. Her expression was serene, almost proud.
"I solve your problems," Sophia repeated, not taking her eyes off the page. The words, so simple, echoed like a direct challenge. Diego let out a loud laugh that reverberated off the luxurious walls. To him, it was impossible that someone so young could even understand what was at stake. Sophia's mother watched anxiously, her hands trembling. She knew the young boss's arrogance well and feared her daughter would be ridiculed. But Sophia showed no fear. On the contrary, she seemed motivated by the challenge. The sparkle in her eyes showed this wasn't a game to her. It was an opportunity to prove something. Diego crossed his legs and rested his chin on his hand, as if watching a theater performance. "Go ahead, genius, show us your magic," he mocked. The advisors, who had been called for another meeting, quietly entered the room and stood in the background, curious about the unusual scene. The little girl wasn't bothered by the stares.
In fact, she seemed to forget she was surrounded by powerful adults. To her, that paper was just another puzzle to solve. Her scribbles transformed into shapes, patterns, sequences. She smiled to herself with each breakthrough, as if discovering a secret game. Diego was starting to lose patience. He expected a quick spectacle of failure, but what he saw was persistence. He shook his head and muttered, "This is a waste of time." Still, he couldn't look away from what the girl was doing. Something inside him said there was more to this than met the eye. "You don't understand any of this," he insisted, trying to undermine Sophia's confidence. But she just looked up and calmly replied, "I see what you don't see." The phrase, coming from a child, sounded almost like a riddle within the riddle. The advisors glanced at each other, intrigued. Diego laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. There was a growing discomfort he didn't want to admit. Sophia was about to reveal a truth that no one there wanted to face. That sometimes genius comes from where you least expect it. At that moment, Diego didn't know it yet, but he was one step away from his first major shock. And his laughter would soon be replaced by stunned silence. Sophia placed the papers on the table and opened her worn notebook. The tip of her pencil drew quick lines, connecting symbols, drawing arrows and circles. To the adults, it looked like child scribbles. But there was a pattern, a logic invisible to ordinary eyes. Her movements were firm and determined, as if she knew exactly where she was headed. Diego drummed his fingers on the table, trying to hide the nervousness he was starting to feel. Every time he looked at Sophia's drawings, a strange sensation ran through him. It couldn't be possible that a child was seeing what dozens of experts had failed to see. Yet the scribbles were making sense, and he couldn't deny it. The advisors cautiously moved closer. One raised his eyebrows in surprise. Another, more skeptical, muttered that it meant nothing. But their fixed gazes on the page betrayed the growing curiosity in everyone. It was like watching a magic trick, but without illusion, just pure logic. Sophia's mother, anxious, wanted to interrupt, but the girl was immersed in an almost hypnotic state. Her lips moved silently, repeating invisible calculations. The pencil didn't stop, and every mark seemed part of a larger puzzle. Suddenly, she stopped, smiled, and pointed to a sequence of symbols. "Look here," Sophia said simply. The natural tone of her voice contrasted with the impact of her words. To her, it was obvious. To the adults, it was a shock. Diego leaned forward, unable to contain his curiosity. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested, not just mocking. The advisors quickly analyzed the scribbles. The silence was broken by one of them who murmured quietly, This makes sense." The others, incredulous, moved even closer, checking the calculations. What seemed like child's play revealed itself as a perfect logical structure. Diego swallowed hard. His laughter had vanished. He still didn't want to accept the idea, but something inside him recognized the truth. Sophia was solving the impossible right before his eyes. The humiliation he had planned was starting to backfire. "But how did you do that?" he asked, trying to maintain his tone of superiority. Sophia just shrugged and replied, "It's like seeing a hidden picture. It was already there. You just didn't look closely enough." The simplicity of the explanation felt like a final blow to Diego's pride. The room, once filled with arrogance, was now immersed in reverent silence. And for the first time in a long time, Diego was speechless. Sophia's pencil rested on the table as if it had fulfilled its mission. She turned the notebook around, showing seemingly simple lines that hid a brilliant answer. The symbols that had appeared indecipherable were now organized in a clear pattern, almost childlike in its directness. The impossible had become understandable. The advisors glanced at each other, some open-mouthed, others still in disbelief. One of them took the notebook with trembling hands, examining every detail. It's the solution. How did we not see this before?" he murmured, unable to believe it. The weight of confirmation filled the room. Sophia had done in minutes what experts had tried to do for months. Diego felt his blood run hot. The scene was too absurd to be real. He, the heir to an empire, was being challenged by a 10-year-old girl. The laughter that had once echoed in the room now seemed distant, swallowed by shame. The shock mixed with something new, silent admiration.
"That doesn't prove anything," he argued, raising his voice. But the advisors ignored him. They were fascinated by the clarity of the solution. It was as if a child had shown them that the adults had been looking at the problem the wrong way all along. Sophia, unaware of the impact, simply smiled with satisfaction. To her, solving that puzzle was as natural as playing with building blocks. There was no arrogance in her demeanor, just the simple joy of someone who loves to discover. The contrast with Diego was striking, and everyone could see it. The heir tried to maintain his composure, but inside, he felt his ego crumbling. This wasn't just any public defeat. It was a cruel exposure of his ignorance. He had always believed that power came from family names and money. Now, a young girl was showing him that true power could lie in a mind the world had overlooked. One advisor, almost reverently, asked Sophia, "How did you manage to see this?" She replied without hesitation, "I just connected the dots that were scattered. You were looking too closely at the details and forgot to see the whole picture." Her explanation was so simple, it stung. Diego looked away. Every word from the girl felt like a needle piercing his pride. He had provoked her, expecting laughter, but the final laugh wasn't his. It was hers. Simple, innocent, yet undeniably victorious. The room, once dominated by the heir's authoritative voice, now belonged to the girl with her worn notebook and dull pencil. And Diego, for the first time, didn't know how to react. That night, Diego locked himself in his room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The face that had always carried arrogance now showed something new: insecurity. What hurt the most wasn't that Sophia had solved the problem, it was how she had done it, with ease, naturalness, and without even seeking recognition. It was just a lucky guess, he whispered to himself, trying to believe it, but the memory of the advisors confirming her solution burned in his mind. The simplicity of her answer contrasted sharply with the complicated explanations experts had offered. And deep down, Diego knew it wasn't luck, it was genius. The next morning, he found a group of advisors talking quietly among themselves, discussing what had happened the day before. When they noticed him, they tried to act normal, but the admiration in their eyes wasn't for him, it was for the girl. Diego felt his pride wounded like never before. "Let's not exaggerate," he said sharply. "She just had a lucky guess." But no one responded. The silence was crueler than any argument. For the first time, Diego realized his words no longer carried the most weight in that room. The authority he had always used as a shield seemed weakened. When he returned home, he found Sophia sitting in the garden, sketching new patterns in her notebook. She greeted him with a carefree smile, without any malice. There was no pride in her attitude, just joy in playing with numbers. This unsettled Diego even more. How could someone so brilliant be so indifferent to her own achievement? He tried to provoke her again. "Do you really think you're smarter than all my advisors?"
Sophia looked up and replied simply, "I don't think about that. I just enjoy solving problems." Her answer, free of arrogance, felt like an invisible slap. Diego's ego was in ruins. He had always believed intelligence came with ambition, and that those who shone would seek recognition. But Sophia broke that logic. Her gift wasn't used for competition, it was for creating, discovering, and having fun. That night, Diego looked at himself in the mirror again. For the first time, he didn't just see the arrogant heir. He saw a man questioning his own worth. Sophia hadn't just solved a puzzle. She had taken Diego apart from the inside. Diego spent the following days in a state of unsettling silence. The mansion's hallways, once filled with his commands and sarcasm, now saw him quiet and distant. His mind kept replaying the same scene, Sophia sketching, smiling, and undoing months of corporate frustration in just minutes. It was a weight he couldn't shake. At the company, meetings continued, but Diego no longer laughed at the advisors. He sat quietly, listening to explanations he would have dismissed before. Every chart showing losses felt like it was screaming in his face, "You don't know everything." The intellectual humiliation had become a wound that followed him in every glance from his subordinates. At home, his arrogance seemed to have faded. Sophia kept playing in the garden, unaware of the change she had sparked. The girl didn't seek recognition or applause. Diego watched from a distance, intrigued. What had been a devastating defeat for him had been nothing more than fun for her. One night, alone in his room, he faced the mirror again. The silence felt heavier than ever. He tried to convince himself he was still the same confident Diego, but the reflection showed a man filled with doubt. For the first time, he wondered if he truly deserved the power he was set to inherit. His wounded pride kept him awake. Every time he remembered Sophia's smile, he felt small. It wasn't just about intelligence, it was about perspective. She saw the world in a way he could never have imagined, and that tormented him. In the company hallways, whispers began to spread. Some advisors questioned whether Diego was truly prepared to lead. He who had always relied on the weight of his family name now found himself surrounded by doubt. The silence from his lips reflected the noise in his mind. Intellectual humiliation is the hardest to carry. Diego, accustomed to easy victories, felt the weight of a defeat he couldn't erase. There was no way to buy, hide, or undo what Sophia had done. It was an undeniable fact.
He started avoiding the girl's gaze. Whenever he passed her in the mansion, he'd look away, as if her presence was a painful reminder. But at the same time, he couldn't help watching her secretly. The contrast between her brilliance and her innocence fascinated him. Diego, the heir who never had to prove anything, was now living in silence. And within that silence, a doubt began to grow, one that would change everything. Maybe he had something to learn after all. Back at company headquarters, tension was rising. Even though Sophia's solution had unlocked part of the problem, new layers of challenges kept emerging. The advisors, feeling insecure, saw the girl's talent as both a threat and an opportunity. But there was something no one dared say out loud: the shame of being outdone by a child. Some began suggesting that Sophia's achievement should be kept secret. They claimed that making it public would be a risk to the company's image. In reality, they feared the girl's genius would expose their own limitations. Collective pride was at stake. Diego, sitting at the table, listened in silence. For the first time, he wasn't laughing. He was torn between his vanity and a strange new sense of fairness. Before, he would have agreed to hide Sophia's role, but now, doing so felt cowardly. Something in him was changing, even if against his own will. One advisor was blunt. "We can't take this child seriously. If word gets out, we'll all be ridiculed." Diego frowned, uncomfortable.
He didn't know how to respond, but his discomfort was real. For the first time, someone was so openly dismissive of Sophia. Voices multiplied, each pushing a different approach. Some wanted to hire even more expensive experts. Others preferred to sweep Sophia's contribution under the rug. In the middle of the chaos, Diego began to realize he was facing a dilemma: side with corporate pride or defend the girl. His heart raced. Pride or truth? The weight of the decision felt crushing. He'd never had to choose between protecting his image and recognizing the value of someone everyone else saw as beneath him. It was an internal battle that ate away at his certainties. Meanwhile, Sophia remained at the mansion, far from the intrigue. She kept sketching in her notebook, unaware that her discovery had started a war of egos among men in suits. To her, problems were just logic games. To them, they were about business and power. Diego, growing quieter, began to realize Sophia wasn't just a footnote in his life. She was a mirror, and in that mirror, he saw the worst of himself: arrogance, ignorance, and the fear of being less than he believed himself to be. This corporate conflict wasn't just about the company. It was about Diego. And it was clear that sooner or later, he would have to choose a side.
The following days were a silent battle within Diego. He tried to keep up his arrogant front, but every time he remembered Sophia's smile when she solved the puzzle, something in him cracked. His pride still screamed at him to ignore the girl, but a new, quieter voice whispered, "Respect." In the mansion, he often found her in the garden, lying on the grass with her notebook on her lap. Sophia wasn't seeking attention, she was just having fun, discovering patterns in the world. Diego watched from a distance, trying to understand how someone so young could see things so clearly. And against his will, he felt admiration. One afternoon, he approached her hesitantly. "Do you understand what you did?" he asked seriously. Sophia just looked up and replied, "I solved the problem. Isn't that what you all wanted?" The simplicity of her answer shattered any attempted grandeur Diego might have mustered. He walked back into the mansion, troubled. His whole life he'd believed intelligence came with power, and that knowledge was a bargaining chip. But Sophia saw none of it as a burden or an advantage. To her, thinking was playing. Solving problems was a pastime, not a glory-seeking act. At the company, the advisors kept trying to sweep the girl's achievement under the rug. They argued that acknowledging her role would undermine the company's credibility. Diego listened silently to every argument, but something in him could no longer stand this convenient lie. The internal conflict ate at him. If he defended Sophia, he'd look weak in front of the advisors. If he stayed silent, he'd confirm his own arrogance. It was like being trapped in a moral maze he'd never learned to navigate. For the first time, there was no easy way out. One rainy night, standing before the mirror, Diego said to himself, "She surpassed me, and I can't pretend it didn't happen." It was the first time he'd admitted defeat out loud. But with that confession came something unexpected: relief, as if acknowledging the truth was the first step towards freeing himself from his arrogance. Still, he didn't know what to do next. His pride resisted, trying to push him back into his old ways. But respect was growing, quietly, inevitably. And Diego knew that sooner or later he would have to make a decision that would change everything. The next morning, the meeting with the advisors began like so many others. Charts, reports, endless discussions. But Diego was different. Seated at the head of the table, he watched each of them carefully, but without his usual sarcasm. Something had changed in his expression. He looked more serious, more resolved. One advisor resumed the usual talking points. "What happened with that child can't be mentioned. We need to protect the company's image." Diego, who would have agreed before, took a deep breath, and then, for the first time, he stood up without hesitation.
"You're wrong," he said firmly. Silence fell over the room. The advisors exchanged surprised glances. Diego continued, "Sophia did what none of you could. She's not a threat to this company's image. She's proof that the world is bigger than our pride." His words echoed powerfully. Some advisors protested, calling it madness to give credit to a child. But Diego didn't back down. For the first time, he wasn't speaking out of arrogance, but out of conviction. This was a different Diego, and everyone felt it. "I won't allow her talent to be erased," he declared. "If we have power, we should use it to open doors, not close them." The impact was immediate. The heir, once seen as spoiled and irresponsible, was now showing courage. It wasn't sarcasm filling his voice anymore. It was determination. The advisors, taken aback, tried to argue, but Diego had already made his decision. He would use his connections to give Sophia the opportunity she deserved. The same power he'd once used for parties and whims was now becoming a bridge to someone's future. Leaving the room, Diego felt a lightness in his heart. It was as if he'd torn down a wall inside himself. For the first time, his decision wasn't about building up his own name. It was about changing someone else's life. That evening, he called Sophia's mother to the mansion and told her, "I'm going to help her. The world needs to see what your daughter can do." The woman's silent tears were the most sincere response he had ever received. Diego had finally chosen a side, and this time, it wasn't his own. Diego didn't waste any time. The next day, he reached out to an old family acquaintance, Professor Helena Duarte, a renowned expert in gifted children. When she heard the story, Helena was skeptical at first, but after meeting Sophia, it took only a few minutes of conversation for her to recognize the genius behind the simplicity. The professor asked Sophia to solve some logic problems. The girl, calm and focused, sketched out the answers in seconds without any strain. Helena fell silent for a moment, watching her with bright eyes. This child isn't just smart, she's a rare talent. She needs to be nurtured, encouraged, and challenged in the right environment. Diego, who had been watching the scene, felt a strange mix of pride and humility. It wasn't pride in himself, but in Sophia. For the first time, his admiration had nothing to do with power, money, or status. It was genuine admiration for something he knew he could never buy. Genius. Helena explained that she knew of an elite school in Switzerland specialized in developing gifted children. There, Sophia would have access to resources, teachers, and opportunities beyond imagination. But there was one obstacle. The costs were exorbitant, impossible for someone in the girl's mother's position. Diego didn't hesitate. He said, "I'll cover everything." Helena was surprised, but didn't question him. She knew that in that moment, the arrogant heir was showing a new side of himself, one that perhaps had always been hidden, but that Sophia had awakened. Sophia's mother, overwhelmed with emotion, couldn't find the words. Her eyes shifted between tears and disbelief. She had never imagined her daughter would have access to something so extraordinary. Sophia, meanwhile, just smiled, as if she didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the opportunity. To her, it was just another adventure of discovery.
Watching that smile, Diego knew he'd made the right choice. His wounded pride no longer mattered, nor did the opinions of the advisors. What mattered was that Sophia would have the chance to grow without the limitations that had once held her back. In that moment, Diego understood that power wasn't about dominating others. It was about creating paths for those who needed them. And that was a lesson that would change his life forever. The preparations moved quickly. Documents, flights, and accommodations were arranged with the efficiency of someone used to solving everything with unlimited resources. But this time, the money wasn't for show. It was for building a future. At the airport, Sophia took everything in with her usual curiosity. She held on to her worn notebook tightly, as if it were her greatest treasure. To her, the world was still one big puzzle, full of patterns waiting to be discovered. The journey didn't scare her, it excited her. Her mother, standing beside her, could barely hold back her tears. She was happy, but also anxious. The fear of the unknown mixed with pride for her daughter. "You're special, my love," she whispered, hugging Sophia tightly. The girl just smiled peacefully, as if she'd always known. Diego watched the scene quietly. He didn't want to intrude on such an intimate moment, but he felt a different weight in his chest. It wasn't his usual arrogance, it was a sense of responsibility. He had changed the destiny of that family, and he knew it would change his own too. Before boarding, Sophia approached Diego. "Thank you for believing in me," she said with the simplicity only a child could have. He swallowed hard. He wasn't used to sincere gratitude, only to self-serving flattery. Those words pierced through his armor of arrogance. "Don't thank me, Sophia. Just show the world what you can do," he replied, trying to sound firm, but inside he felt vulnerable. That little girl had taught him a lesson no advisor or university ever could. As the plane took off, Diego remained in the terminal, watching the emptiness left by their departure. There were no more sarcastic laughs, just the silence of someone who was finally beginning to understand the true meaning of greatness.
And in that silence, a new promise was born. Diego would no longer just be the arrogant heir. He would learn to become worthy of the future he was now helping to build. Months later, Diego received a letter written in a child's handwriting, simple but steady. It was from Sophia, now in Switzerland. She wrote about her classes, the labs, the teachers who challenged her with even more complex puzzles. She described the cold mountain air, her new friendships, and the feeling of finally being in a place that made sense to her restless mind. Diego read every word carefully, something he rarely did. The letter didn't talk about missing home or luxury. It was all about discovery. Sophia described patterns she found in the stars, in physics formulas, even in snowflakes. To her, the whole world was one big code waiting to be cracked. The heir felt a pride he'd never experienced before. It wasn't pride in his own achievements, but in having helped someone else shine. For the first time, his wealth had served something greater than his own ego. That single act hadn't just changed Sophia's life, it had changed his too. At the company, his attitude had started to shift. Diego listened more, laughed less at others' mistakes, and sought to learn from experts instead of mocking them. The advisors noticed the change. Though suspicious at first, they began respecting him in a new way, not as the arrogant heir, but as someone transforming. On quiet nights, Diego remembered the moment Sophia had said, "I solve your problems." The phrase, once a joke, now sounded like a reminder. She had solved more than a puzzle. She had solved something inside him, the blindness caused by arrogance and privilege. Sophia's mother sent updates too. She shared how her daughter was growing happier, exploring a world that once seemed out of reach to her. Diego read every message quietly, feeling part of that story of growth. For the first time, he saw value in something beyond profit and status. The future no longer felt like a burden to Diego. He knew he still had much to learn, but he was willing. And when he thought of Sophia, he understood that his greatest victory wasn't about dominating the world. It was about letting hidden talents flourish. In the heir's heart, a silent promise took shape. He would never underestimate anyone again, because he had learned in the most unexpected way
that genius can appear in the most unlikely places. And while Sophia sketched her own future in the pages of her notebook, Diego, for the first time, began writing his own for real. If this transformation moved you, don't miss the next stories of lives turned upside down. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single journey.